Um, my name is Pratik, and today we're going to talk about top app monetization tactics. So moving on, a bit about myself, right? And I'll try to describe this as pictorially as I can. Have an extensive background in working in the financial services industry around data and trading. While doing that, went to Cambridge and also climbed the Everest. So that's sort of my background. Been at InMobi for over a year and a half now. Um, been working with a variety of developers, various sizes, and various sort of app categories, and that's sort of given us a very good view or insight into what's happening in the ecosystem. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today as well. So to begin off with, this is sort of my favorite slide, where the question really is, what do these completely disparate entities have in common? Right? And if you see some of the entities, it's Walmart to banking guys like Citi to Zynga, and finally the last entity, yeah, it's not Brad Pitt, it's actually Moneyball. That's a movie. If you guys haven't seen it, you should check it out. What's interesting is that all of these folks have one thing in common, which is the ability to actually gather and see a huge amount of data, use that data to gain key insights out of those, and actually take actions based on those key insights. So the examples over here, Walmart is actually mining customer data and understanding their customers like no other company right now. Citi is trying to do the same thing using advanced data mining technologies. Zynga claims itself to be an analytics company. They actually say we're not a gaming company. We're actually an analytics company. And finally, Moneyball. It's actually a story or a real story about Billy Bean, a manager who actually won and chose baseball players based on data analysis. So this is all great, but how is this relevant for an app developer, you may ask? State of the union, folks. It's interesting that with the current ecosystem, you have 700,000 iOS and Android apps. But you know what? 60% of app developers don't even break even. What's more startling is the fact that 30% of apps are actually only opened once. So it's a really tough world out there. And our take is that only folks who are able to run their app business smartly or intelligently will actually win. So the agenda for today's webinar is I'm thinking of actually going through some of the best practices that I've seen personally working with a variety of app developers and some of our top app developers who actually do this very well. Go through some of the monetization models, go through some of the key metrics that they're actually looking at while actually running around their business. Get into the second mode of customer segmentation, and this is a very interesting concept, and we'll talk about why it's interesting, why it's important, and how do you actually go about doing it. And finally, get into some use cases. Great. So starting off with some best practices that we've seen around. The first one that I wanted to cover was monetization. Right? And the idea is that there are a variety of monetization models that have sprung up, and especially lately in the ecosystem. And it's sort of important to identify them and classify them in some buckets so that it's easy to understand. The way we look at it is actually they're broadly classified as in-app purchases, which is consumer base, right? And consumer base actually could be anything from paid downloads to in-app purchases to merchandising from consumers to subscription models and way many more. And sort of the second bucket that we see is advertiser pays. And uh, again, here, variety of models, banners, interstitials, cross promotion networks, offer walls, incentivized advertising, you name it. What's interesting and important over here is that no one model is a winner. It actually has to be looked at case by case. And interestingly, what an app developer right now is at a position at is you guys can actually pick and choose which ones you want to go with and combine any one of these. The second best practice that has been around in the industry for a few years, and it's actually growing as we speak, is the freemium model. And to explain what the freemium model is, it's very simple. Think of freemium model as a way to actually allow consumers to experience your app for free, which means sell your app for free on the app stores, and then monetize them using in-app purchases inside the app. And these could be for specific content, for specific features, uh, you name it. So it depends on what your app is like. Right? The reason this model is amazing is because not only does it remove the lower barrier of consumers to actually try your app, it actually removes the upper barrier as well of what you could price your app at. So to explain this, if you went with a pure paid app, you'd probably price your app at 99 cents, maybe a few dollars if it's really niche. Right? With the freemium model, what you can now do is actually put that app on for free, get as many customers as possible. And you know what? Some of the customers will actually pay a lot in your app, making up for much more than what you would have made in the paid download. And this cartoon actually sort of illustrates that as well, right? Where a couple of guys talking about how freemium model is great and they've been able to try out certain apps. The reality is that a few guys really end up spending $8,000 in an app. Sounds quite insane, but we actually have customers who are earning thousands of dollars from their users. Right? So it's not sci-fi. It's actually reality. And you know the best part? It's not limited to gaming apps. You could use the freemium model in any kind of app you have. You just have to figure out the mechanics of how to charge users for and when to charge users. Great. So another sort of best practice that a lot of industry people have been talking about since the last few years is, hey, you know what, app developers need to get metric driven. But what does that really mean? A lot of developers then said, hey, perfect, let's get metric driven. Let's just slap on some analytics provider while we're building the app, look at some data. But you know what? That's not really enough. Most app developers end up then getting lost sort of in all the kind of data and reporting and charting and not knowing what's important to measure and when. So the important aspect over here is to see if there is sort of a structured way to look at this and understand what elements are important to measure and when. So one of our philosophies actually is keep it simple, right? Focus on maximizing the value of every user in the ARM cycle, right? And the ARM cycle actually stands for acquisition, retention, and monetization. And every single user that's actually using your app goes through this cycle. It's important that during this cycle, you are able to focus on individually each of these users and maximize their value. So what does that really mean? Uh, what you need to focus on is the app value, which is the product of the number of users you have times the lifetime value of every user. So what is lifetime value? Think of lifetime value as the sum of the value generated by a particular user over his or her entire time in your app itself. So in some sense, you should think of lifetime value or LTV as it's called in the industry as a product of value generated by a user and the engagement time of that user in your app. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of people look at this and say, hey, we know LTV, we know lifetime value, and it's all about revenue, right? But that's not true, actually. What you need to look at value is actually much more holistically and realize that the value levers are beyond monetization, right? So monetization does account for one of the highest value levers, but what's also important to look at are aspects like virality, how users are actually helping you acquire other users and sort of helping you climb the App Store ranking in some sense. Uh, Loyalty, again, how you certain users are able to stick in your app longer, and as a result of that, promoting your app, uh, talking to other friends about it. Community, again, another way to sort of increase the value of your app. Feedback, key one, where you see early adopters or your power users actually giving you feedback on your app features, helping you build a better app and obviously increasing the value. And finally, marketplace, which is again in terms of downloads, ratings, comments, all key things which will all key into the value that is generated by a user. Great. So the next sort of aspect that I wanted to touch base on was the key metrics that you needed to track. And if you remember, the whole aspect of metric-driven app development is to not really get lost in just trying to measure for the sake of it. There is a structured approach to go about doing this. And some of the things that we've seen our top app developers do is what I'll go through with you guys. So the first aspect that most developers look at is audience, right? And the things to understand over here are your daily active users and monthly active users. What's happening to them? What's that trend? What's that number looking like on a daily basis and a monthly basis, right? Important to measure and sort of follow because it obviously tells you how your app's doing. Demography, which goes into explaining or rather understanding where your users are coming from, which demography, um, what kind of uh, devices are they using, what kind of operating systems are they using. Again, important key things to understand. The next bit that we want to talk about is acquisition. So think of acquisition as a process of acquiring users for your app. Variety of techniques and variety of ways to do this. But the things that you want to measure over here are the first one, which is cost per acquisition. So when you're acquiring users, you have two broad categories of doing that. You can either pay for this or you can have non-paid mechanisms, rather organic mechanisms in which you could actually acquire users. For the paid aspects, you're actually incurring a cost per user. And it's important to understand what that cost is. And even more importantly, if you're using multiple ways to acquire users, you need to attribute what the cost is to every channel of acquisition. And the second thing that you want to do is to understand what the return on investment is on each of these acquisition channels or acquisition campaigns. ROI is obviously measured as a difference between value and cost per acquisition. And obviously the acquisition channels or acquisition uh, campaigns that are giving you positive ROI is what you need to focus more on. Retention, here it's important to measure a few key things. One is obviously stickiness, which is actually DAU by MAU. And what this tells you is how often are your users actually coming in your app within a month? And it's important to know this because this sort of gives you indications of the engagement levels in your app. And you want to benchmark this and compare this to other industry standards with your app category. Second thing that you want to measure is retention rate, which is, think of this as 7-day retention, 30-day retention, 90-day retention, which means the day when a lot of your users actually came in, what happened to them after 7 days? What happened to them after 30 days? And what happened to them after 90 days? How many percent of users are actually left after 90 days? Believe me, it's actually quite low. The industry standard itself is quite low. So important to sort of, again, benchmark this and make sure that you're there. And finally, monetization. Few key things over here as well. First one is conversion rate. Think of this as the split between paying and non-paying users, or even more importantly, how many of your non-paying users are actually converted to becoming paying. Uh, Fairly important to track again because most apps have about 10% paying users, and that's an optimistic number, right? The second thing that you want to measure over here is ARPU and ARPPU. To explain these acronyms, it's actually average revenue per user, which is your total revenue of your app divided by the number of users. Usually best to do this at a daily level. And the second one is ARPPU, which was average revenue per paying user, right? So again, total revenue divided by the total paying users in your app. These two will be fairly different, obviously, because your number of paying users itself are much less. So again, important to measure both of them. Great. So with all of this background on what are the key metrics and what are the key best practices we've seen, one of the topics that I wanted to highlight specifically was customer segmentation. So what is customer segmentation, right? It's interesting. It's actually a practice that's been around in some of the older industries for a fairly long time now. And it's now catching up with app developers as well, and the app ecosystem. Um, it's actually a way in which you can take your customer base and divvy them up, actually divide them into a variety of buckets. And the way you actually divide them are based on certain attributes or based on certain dimensions. Right? And these dimensions could be time spent, could be amount of engagement in your app, could be purchase spends. So what this allows you to do, in a sense, is to say, look, I have 1 million users in my app, right? And that's great. But now I can say 10,000 high-paying users, maybe 100,000 users who are highly engaged, right? Make another bucket saying these many users are my advanced users, meaning they've used so many of my features. So you can combine a lot of these dimensions and make these segments. Think of these segments as a way in which, or sort of akin to what big banks or big telecom companies do to their customers as well. They create these silver, gold, platinum segments or customer bases. And what they then do is treat each one of them completely differently, right? So they have a different level of service for each customer. They have a completely different experience for these customers. And that's what you need to do for your app as well. So customer segmentation, how does this really work, right? So the concept is awesome. How do you actually practically do this? Fairly simple. What you need here is a flexible rule engine, which helps you define the behaviors or the attributes that you want to use as dimensions, right? And these dimensions could be, as I said, it could be purchase history, saying I want to segment users who purchased more than certain amount or who purchased less than certain amount in the last month, for example. Total time spent, saying, okay, I want to segment users who have spent a lot of time, or session length, which is saying that let's create a segment of users who are sort of spend a lot of time with my app whenever they come on board. Right? So when they start my app, they're actually there for half an hour, maybe few hours. Interesting. Advancement. So you can use this to understand users who've used a lot of your features in your app. Session frequency. Think of this as how many times has users come in your app, right? So you can say, look, I want to create a segment of users who open my app daily or every few hours. And there are apps who actually see this. Newspaper apps, chat applications have a lot of very frequent use of their apps. And finally, you can also use country, carrier, device, variety of these mechanisms, and combine all of these guys, right, to create all the segments that you want. Once you've created all these segments, what you also want to do now is to say, look, for every segment, I want to track some metrics using this prism of a segment. Right? So saying, I want to now understand what the engagement levels, what the ARPUs, ARPU, which was the average revenue per user, is for every segment. Useful and important to understand. So with that taken care of, let's jump into some of the use cases and see how our developers are actually using a lot of this science to actually put it to use. Again, keeping it simple, we'll go through the ARM cycle and individually understand what aspects of these are being leveraged. So acquisition, right? Basics over here, obviously, it's becoming more and more expensive in the industry to acquire users. And you'll hear this crib by a variety of developers. Uh, what you need to do over here at the first instance is to make sure that when you're paying for acquiring users, you have a ROI positive engine running in your app. Right? And what that means is you need to ensure that you're actually extracting value or more value out of the users that you acquire than what you paid to acquire them. Measurements, we talked about what we need to measure. Um, some of the interesting techniques that we've seen developers use and to actually optimize this aspect of user acquisition has been a couple of them very interesting. The first one is internal cross promote. So if you have a portfolio of apps, the cheapest thing for you to do is actually move your highly engaged users from one app to another. The second thing that's also very cost effective is viral. Again, highly engaged users or users who come to your app a lot or users who pay a lot, hardcore users, right? Like users who actually truly appreciate your app. Those are the folks who will probably be best suited to help your app go viral. These are the guys who will actually go and talk to their friends and wouldn't mind telling them, hey, why don't you check out this app? It's awesome. So you need to take advantage of these mechanisms that you have over and on top of the usual ways of acquiring users, which is using performance networks and paying for acquiring users. So some of the use cases that one of the use cases I want to go through is the first aspect of this is that a lot of our developers are identifying patterns, and a pattern that has been identified is saying, look, my users who are highly engaged, right, are most likely to give or help me acquire new users, or are most likely to give me a viral uplift. Right? Identifying that pattern, then moving to the next step, we're saying, okay, great. So this is a common industry pattern. How do I take advantage of this? Use segmentation and segment a group of users which says, hey, look, if these users in my app are spending more than X minutes, right, and this could be hours depending on your app, or it could be minutes, right? Or if they're spending more money, or if they're coming to the app a lot, whatever your definition of highly engaged is. Right? So if certain users are spending more than, for example, 300 hours and are from a specific country, you know what? Show them a message which says, follow us on Facebook and we'll actually give you a free month. So you could use this in interesting ways. You could either just say, hey, why don't you follow us on Facebook? We know that you love our app, and not incentivize them at all. Or you could say, hey, you know what? Follow us on Facebook and we'll give you a reward. And that reward could be whatever you want. Right? So that's the segment of users, and that's the action that you could take on them, which is to incentivize virality. We've seen this being fairly effective, where developers have actually reduced their cost per acquisition by as much as 50%. The second sort of pattern which is in the seen in the industry is the cross promotion aspect of it, right? And this was about your advanced users in one of your apps, and usually in a portfolio of apps, most developers have that one brilliant app, that one top app that's stood out. And what you want to do is have this group of users, and again, out of this group of users, the ripe users, and move them to the other apps in your portfolio. Again, the way to do this is first create a segment using the rule engine. Um, your rule could be as simple as if the user has crossed certain levels, if it's a gaming app, or if the user has used certain features, and that user does not have your second app, right? Then the message that you want to show them is, we know you love this app, and you know what? We have a new app for you, which we believe you would love. So here's a recommended app for you. So again, on the right hand side, you can see this action. And what this action allows you to do is increase your return of investment by acquiring your most valuable users, users that you know are good for you. Moving on, the second aspect in the ARM cycle, which is retention, right? Basics again, super, super important, right? This is probably one of the most important aspects of app development, but it's also one of the most difficult aspects of it. If you actually look at the graph on the left-hand side, you'd see that industry-wide and a variety of reports and research reports have actually talked about this, is that most app developers lose their users on the first day or after the first day, right? Uh, that's scary. What you now want to do is A, make sure that you measure all of this, and B, obviously, again, use techniques to ensure that your actual retention is much more than what the industry standards are. Some of the things that are important to measure that we've already talked about, stickiness, retention rate, right? One thing that I wanted to highlight over here was cohort analysis. Now, cohort analysis is a technique used by a variety of advanced app developers, and it's actually not that tough. The concept is simple. What you want to do is create cohorts, which is saying create group of users who have come in at a specific day, uh, and then follow them over time, right? Watch their activity over time. What's happening to that cohort of users? And the reason you want to do this is because most likely users who come in on individual days have been acquired because of certain aspects of what you've done, right? You may have run a campaign, you may have run an internal cross promotion, it might have been Christmas, so whatever that event is, and that led to all these users coming into your app for the first time, you want to follow them over the next few days and weeks and see how individually these are performing, because this will give you signals to what's actually the right thing to do for you. And the second thing that you want to do is measure how many users actually return to your app, generally, second time, third time, fourth time, and so on. Again, that will give you a measure of what your retention rates are. So that was measurement. Right? Let's talk about some interesting techniques to actually improve retention. A few things you see. The first one that I want to talk about is clean early experience, right? So I can't emphasize how important this is. And the fact that When a user is coming onto your app the first time, or his or her first day, what you want to do is you want to make sure that that experience is tight. No messy pop-ups or ads in their face. Um, Possibly have tutorials come up for him or her at specific times. Maybe have a welcome message. Anything that could make that experience delightful. The second thing that you want to look at is localizing content. Now, again, this is important because let's face it, most of our apps are actually now being used by users in countries that we don't even know how to pronounce. Uh, what's important over here is to focus on certain key countries and see if you could possibly have localized content, if not in your app, but at least as specific messages to users, which will again help make that experience delightful. And finally, gamification. This is sort of the new buzzword in the industry, where developers are using a variety of ways, such as rewards, challenges, and so on, to actually engage the users. Right? So I'm going to give you a few examples of how we've seen users, our developers do this. Again, the first one, a commonly identified pattern in the industry, new users are likely to be delighted to see a tailored message. Right? Um, Again, super easy to do. What you want to do is create a segment of users who are actually new in your app. And you can define that by either number of app launches or time spent or whatever that is. Right? And if the country is, say, China, for example, what you want to do here is show them a localized welcome message. This will help you obviously increase your retention beyond the first day. The second sort of identified pattern in the industry is that user engagement can drastically be improved by social mechanisms. Again, an example of this is use a segmentation rule engine to figure out which of your users were actually maybe were spending a lot of time and are recently not spending a lot of time. You could use time spent or number of app launches as a proxy and say, look, if the users are spending less amount of time in my app in the last month, uh, then you know what? Maybe it's a good time to show them a message. Uh, in this specific example, we're showing a message which says, hey, you know what? Your rank is number 25 among your friends. Uh, this is not cool, buck up, or anything which is sort of interesting, which excites that particular user to say, all right, I'm going to play some more, or I'm going to use this app a little bit more. Moving on to the final part of the ARM cycle, which is monetization, and probably the most relevant aspect because this is where you see the dollars. Right? Some basics over here again. Using a freemium model has interesting sort of aspects in your app. What you start seeing is that not all users are the same. And by that, what I mean is not all users pay the same. In the graph, we're actually showing how users go from peasants, which are completely non-paying users, to kings, who are hardcore purchasers. The industry standards usually segment their users as calling them minnows, dolphins, and whales. So you can call them whatever you want, but the basic concept is that a very tiny fraction of your paying users, and this is generally 10% of your paying users, account for 60% of your revenue. Now that's huge. You're actually talking about a handful of customers, a few hundreds, a few thousands, depending on your total number of customers, who are accounting for most of your revenue. And then you have dolphins, the folks who are actually paying enough to contribute as a sizable amount of your revenue, sometimes around 30 to 40%, uh, and around 30% of your users. And then you finally have most the rest of the folks who generally not pay much or not pay at all, or maybe pay just once. And that accounts to a lot of users in your app, but very little amount of revenue. Now, understanding this and knowing this means that the first thing that you want to do is actually price goods along the curve, right? Which means that you want to price goods which are affordable for minnows and have enough goods for the folks who don't pay as much, and going up to goods which for your kings or for your whales, where you can have highly expensive, valuable aspects of your app, which you can sell to them at a premium price. Some of the important things to measure over here, which we already talked about, the conversion rate, the ARPU, ARPPU. What you want to look at these, both of these, is again under the lens of the customer profile split. So you want to understand what's individually what's happening to your whales, dolphins, and minnows. So great, that's all measurement, right? Moving on to again some interesting techniques which you could use. Few things that we've noticed in the industry: holiday and event specific stuff, super valuable. You can make a lot of money out of this, and timely offers. So again, an identified pattern in the industry: your hardcore users would actually pay a lot for certain features. So having understood that, what you want to do is create a segment of users where you're only sort of targeting these hardcore users and understanding which part of your app are they using. What are they doing? Are they stuck at a particular level? If it's a game, are they stuck at a particular aspect of the app? Do you see them at a point where they look like they would be willing to pay a lot? Um, and you know what? At that time, show them an offer which says, hey, you know what? You could buy this and you could unlock this, right? You could go faster. You could actually uh, become better, use better aspects of your app, whatever that is, maybe. So the example over here is something that I've always thought of as well, is Words with Friends. It's a game by Zynga, and uh, the way you play this game is you actually play it with a friend. And a variety of times I've sort of thought to myself, I'm stuck at this word, and it would be cool if I could actually get a cheat at this time. Right? Maybe I would pay for it. Obviously, I'm not a hardcore user, but there are a lot of hardcore users who would pay a lot to cheat at different aspects. And finally, identify the last pattern, which is interesting, right? Is highly paying users in developed economies actually tend to purchase a lot during holidays. So another interesting aspect where you're saying, look, it's holiday season, and I probably want to use this time, and this holiday season could be Halloween, could be Christmas, it could be Chinese New Year for all you know, right? So figuring out that time of the year and then saying, great, at this particular time and for a segment of users which are maybe my highly paying users and this particular country. So say for example, Halloween, very specifically useful in US and UK or celebrated in US and UK. Create that segment of users and target them with holiday promotions, right? Again, this helps you add cyclical sort of revenue into your entire sales itself, right? So for some reason, the image in my app is actually, in my slides is actually not coming up, but yep, it was about selling Halloween specific virtual goods to your users or Christmas specific aspects to your app. So great. How does a developer now go about doing all of this? Right? It's actually not that easy. So a few sort of broad steps in of all what we've talked about till now. The first thing is to decide what data to collect and how should you actually be going about collecting this. Again, important not to get confused or sort of enamored by just metrics, but to keep it structured and say, let's just focus on the key things. Right? The second aspect is collecting this data from a variety of sources and perhaps using standard analytics tools, Issues with a lot of those where a lot of key metrics might and might not come in. More importantly, the third aspect, right, which is having the ability to use that data to perform big data analysis on your segments and create these customer segments in real time. Now, that's certainly not easy. Right? And the final step, which is then going in and saying, let's build an in-house messaging server, right? And obviously, this messaging server has to be globally scaled. That's actually a lot of things to do, and certainly not necessarily the core aspect of what most developers set out to do. So, do you really have to do all of this, or could this all be really easier? Right? So, we actually at InMobi, we think that it should be fairly easy. It should be something that a lot of developers, a lot of you folks need to have at your fingertips without really worrying about all of this. Right? That's where we're actually coming out with a platform fairly soon, which will help you guys do all of what we've just talked about in a very elegant way, a fairly open platform, which allows you to do pretty much what you need to do over here. You guys should go check out inmobi.com/LTV teaser and sign up for it. Right? So that's pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. What I would now like to do is open it up for questions. You can send in your questions to Andy and we'll actually start taking each one of them as we go on.
Hey folks, yeah, so just go ahead and post those questions into the Q&A panel on the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll get those routed to you. One question we had was about cyclic bursting of offers. Can you give more elaboration on what that refers to?
Absolutely, Andy. So that was the aspect which I was talking about, where you could take advantage of holiday seasons or events. And you know what? There are a variety of holiday seasons and variety of events worldwide going on. And what you want to do is take advantage of them, right? Have event-specific customizations in your app. Say Olympics in London. What you could have done, what developers could have done very interestingly over there, is actually customize their app experience maybe in UK to Olympics experience, right? Sell specific goods or sell specific aspects of the app which are Olympic specific, right? These customizations go a long way to adding that particular burst in your app, where app revenue, where you suddenly see a spike of a lot of these uh, in-app virtual goods being acquired at those times by those users. So that's what I meant by the cyclic burst.
Another question was about how much of this applies to non-gaming apps versus a gaming app. I know this morning we had a question about how it applies to like a magazine news app. So how does these different metrics vary between a gaming app and a non-game application?
Great question again, Andy. So you know what? All of these metrics are certainly not limited or tied to gaming apps. It's actually all correlated more to the freemium model. And believe me, this model is actually taking off in a variety of apps that I've seen. I have examples of utility apps who are taking advantage of the freemium model, and as a result of this, having to track all of these metrics, having to segment the users, and do the same actions, right? Newspaper apps doing the exact same thing, where newspaper apps sort of selling certain aspects of their app as subscription models, having to do the same thing. Right? Chat applications or texting applications. We've seen a lot of those having premium features, and again having to go through this entire uh, cycle of measuring, acting on them, and optimizing over it. So yeah, certainly not limited to gaming apps.
Alrighty, another question is how difficult would it be for a first-time developer to integrate InMobi to monetize their app? I think this is about using the SDK.
Sure. So I'll take that. So the InMobi SDK is are fairly easy. Um, we have very good documentation, and we've actually seen a lot of our developers come on board in a matter of hours, actually. So, and the best part of this, or the beauty of this, is that you can do this not necessarily as a big in a big bang way, but you could also do this iteratively, where you integrate certain aspects of the monetization SDKs, get some value of that, and then measure that, and then optimize it to have more features sort of integrated. So, uh, super easy, and certainly get in touch with us if you have questions around that. We have uh, sort of solid 24/7 support team, which will help you get through all of this as well.
All right. One more question was, how does this process change going to a B2B app? So if the app is like a custom app for a company internally, or if it's externally business to business apps, how does the metrics change in that equation?
Great question, right? So with a B2B app, you still want to measure a lot of this, right? Because in the end, you still have users and you want to understand and measure what aspects of your app are adding value to those users. And these users could be consumers in most apps cases, or it could be business users, right? Uh, some aspects will not be as relevant. Some aspects like revenue, for example, because you're not probably not charging individual business users. Um, if you are, even better, right? But that's having said that, most of the other aspects like engagement, like retention, like understanding which aspects of your app are more used than the other aspects, key things to measure.
All right, and we'll just do one final question. This is a general question about the SDK, about what ad formats we support, full screen ads, banner ads, statistics, about both of those. What are the different placements that the SDK can support?
Great question again. So our current InMobi SDK supports a variety of ad formats actually. So we do support banner ads, which have been the standard in the industry for a long time. Uh, we also support interstitials. For folks who know interstitial, it's actually a full page ad, comes up at an appropriate time. What's actually fairly interesting is that we have a variety of brand advertisers coming onto our network. And as a result of that, a lot of the ads that you will see are very nice, high quality, rich media ads. All of this adds to the experience of your own app, and hence a user's interest in your app sort of obviously gets increased. Your app monetization gets increased because the user is more likely to click and sort of go through and experience a good rich media ad. Obviously, rich media includes video, um, audio, interstitials, all the shebangs. And I guess as a final word, again, if you think about what we just talked about, fairly complex and fairly important aspects to do as you start running your app businesses. What we want to make sure from InMobi is that it's easy for you guys to do all that we talked about. And again, we're actually coming out with some platforms which will help you do this and help you get on board with doing all of these seemingly complex things in the matter of minutes or hours, right? So certainly go on to inmobi.com/LTV teaser, sign up, and we'll get in touch with you.